Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on gender studies, today we would be talking on feminists and their lives. And for this very discussion on the topic, we have once again with us in our studios Ms. Inayat Chaudhary. Ms. Inayat Chaudhary is going to give you a deep insight into the topic feminists and their lives. So let's welcome Ms. Inayat Chaudhary and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through her. Hello Ms. Inayat Chaudhary, welcome to the UGC lecture.
Hello Geetika. Hello students, welcome to the lecture. Today I will be discussing on feminists and their lives. In today's session, what I will be chiefly doing is first looking at few of the famous feminists in the world, then looking at few of the famous feminists in India. So let us begin. Now, one of the most famous feminists that one knows and one comes across is Mary Wollstonecraft. Who was she? Let us look at the slides. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in 1759 in London. She is considered to be among the most influential feminists. Her paternal grandfather had left some fortune behind, but her father, Edward John, who was not very successful, he was not a very successful person, and most of his life he had to spend in financial instability. What is important for us to understand here is that feminists too had to go through a lot of situations, a lot of circumstances which prevented and made them suffer a kind of discrimination which a lot of women face in contemporary times. And it was these circumstances, it was these situations which paved the way for them to write certain works which today are considered to be the most famous in the writings of literature. So one such feminist that I am looking at is Mary Wollstonecraft. Of course there are many other, but she is considered to be a pioneer because she spoke at a time and wrote certain aspects at a time when women were not accepted to be very vocal about their situation and about the way the society tried to bring them down in the hierarchical social order. So what was the time that she was writing in? The time was the period of Enlightenment. Now I would like to give a background on the period of Enlightenment before we proceed with the discussion of the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, let us understand what I am trying to say here. Mary Wollstonecraft was a famous writer of her time, and she wrote during the period of Enlightenment. Enlightenment was significant in its own way. Why? Because of certain characteristics, like the idea of rationality. The idea of rationality was very important. People began to question everything that they believed was irrational. Similarly, the whole base of scientific revolution that took place during this period was actually settled on this idea of rationality. So scientific revolution came into being because of this very idea of rationality. Things which were proved began to be accepted. And those aspects, those ideas which could not be proven, which could not make rational sense, were immediately rejected. So the idea of rationality came into being. People began to challenge situations. Various revolutions came up, like the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Now, amidst all these things in the background, we come across one such lady, Mary Wollstonecraft, who changed the history of the world by her explosive writings. In fact, of course, now they are not considered explosive, but during that time, that was a time when women were not given much freedom, and that was a time when women were not allowed to raise their voice over issues which they considered wrong. So now I will be looking at Mary Wollstonecraft in detail, of course. So let us begin. Like I said, she was born in 1759 and she was the second of the 7 children of Elizabeth Dixon and Edward John Wollstonecraft. The picture below that you see is of the famous Mary Wollstonecraft. Now what one realizes is that it was only Edward, Mary's brother, who could actually receive formal education. Mary herself did not receive much of the education. In terms of a proper schooling, there was no proper schooling for Mary. Mary had to self-teach herself. She was a governess at various places. She inculcated the knowledges that she got by various real-life experiences. So unlike her brother Edward, Mary did not get that kind of education. Her father was also very brutal. He was an alcoholic. He often did not treat his mother well. Her mother well. Mary's mother was not treated well by Mary's father. Not only that, even the children were abused. A lot of time, even it is believed when one goes through Mary's biographical information, one notices that not only the children, not only the wife, but it was also Mary herself who had to go through the discrimination that the father put on across them. Now Mary was somebody, I mean, in this sense, one can say the rebellious attitude of Mary can be said to have come from, those streaks seems to have come from her very own father. She was rebellious, she stood for what's right, and she openly criticized for what she felt was not accordingly to the rational existence. Now let us look at it. She played the similar role of protector for her siblings. Why am I saying that? Because through her biographical information, one realizes, for instance, that one of her sisters was suffering through postpartum depression. And she was the one who encouraged her to leave the home, to leave the household for some time, so that all the necessary arrangements are made by her so that she can have a better living because of the situation, because of the whole idea of depression that she was going through. So she did make arrangements for her. But again, since it was the 18th century, it did not go down well by many members of the society. And this was constantly rebuked upon, and this made it very difficult for her sister as well as Mary to be looked with respect, to be looked down with respect. So what one understands is that through her writing, not only through her writing, even through the life that she lived, she had to go through certain situations which polished her to be what she was, which made her state certain things in her epitomic writings. And that is what I am trying to show here through my discussion today on this topic that I have taken up, feminists and their lives. Now, there were these two other important people whom she met. One such individual was Jane Arden. Now, who was Jane Arden? One was Jane Arden, the second was Frances Blood. She was also known as Fanny. Now, along with Jane Arden, since we know that Mary did not have any kind of formal education, along with Jane Arden, Mary actively pursued reading of various books, attending various lectures. And Jane Arden's father was a very famous experimental philosopher. So a lot of ideas, the ideology, the theories, the developing of her intellect, the polishing of her cognitive abilities came from the interactions that she engaged in when she was maybe with Jane Arden, or again ahead with Fanny, or again her publisher, who was very encouraging and encouraged her to publish the writings which now turned out to be the most, almost amongst the famous ones. Now, this period, like I said, not only polished her intellectual capabilities, but also made her feel emotionally close to Jane. And this emotional attachment can be seen through the letters that one views, which is written by Mary to Jane later in life. She became extremely attached to Jane. So what we are understanding about Mary Wollstonecraft is that she was not only intellectually superior, she was also, just like all of us, an emotional being. And all these incidences shaped her life. Now let's talk about the next individual that she met. The next individual was Frances Blood. She was known as Fanny, and like I can see that along with whom and the sisters, she went on to open a school. Now, Mary also engaged in several kind of jobs. She was a governess, she went to open a school, therefore she was also kind of an educator, and she also built up very strong emotional relationships with various individuals in her life. And so when Fanny became ill, she was very ill, therefore Mary left the school and she went to help her out, aid her in recovering again. This, however, led to the shutting down of the school because the school could not be continued, and unfortunately even the nursing could not help Fanny, and she eventually died. Now this incident again had a tremendous impact on Mary Wollstonecraft. Why? Because she eventually went on to write and talk about Fanny, who soon became her inspiration in the first novel, let me quote, Mary, a fiction written in 1788. Now, after the death of Fanny, she took up a job of a governess at Kingsborough family at Ireland. Now, here her experience was not very good, but the people whom she educated, the children, the younger ones, did find her very intelligent and did appreciate her. And all this experience again goes into the work and can be seen in the 1788 work known as Original Stories from Real Life. Therefore, as I have spoken about, Mary Wollstonecraft went on to pursue various jobs to support her family, be it that of a lady's companion, be it a tutor, be it a school teacher, or be it a governess. In this, she clearly explores the whole idea of the limited career options that is and that were available to the women of those times. Now, taking up the career of being a writer was a rare option during that time, chiefly because it was a not very uplifting time for the women, but again because of the background that we were working in, the whole idea of enlightenment, certain individuals decided to stand up for themselves, and one of such individuals, as we can see from the life of Mary Wollstonecraft, she was the one who decided that it is time that she stands up for herself. In fact, in one of her letters to her sisters, when she decided to choose writing as a career, she clearly states, let me quote from here, she was trying to become the first of a new genus. Her writings did a corpus of various works, like short stories for children, book reviewer for analytical reviewer writings on many political commentaries on the French Revolution, and for a brief period, tourist narrative on her travels to Scandinavia. Now, what we notice here? One notices that her writings varied. She wrote certain travel narratives when on her visit to Scandinavia. She wrote various political commentaries. She wrote various short stories on children. But it was eventually the political commentaries which took her to a level which made her overnightly famous. Now, these political commentaries which I am talking about included several debates with the most popular philosophers of that time. Now, these debates, she wrote several writings during that time, which were in response to Rousseau, which were in response to Edmund Burke, and these writings were the one which were very impactful because of the time they were primarily being written in, and chiefly they were coming from women about there were certain ideas which usually nobody had raised. Of course, there were other individuals who had raised those ideas. Let me not say that it was solely Mary Wollstonecraft. If we do some research, we realize that there were a lot of individuals who were active, who did speak about women's education, but it was chiefly Mary Wollstonecraft whose way of whose way of responding to them made it all the more famous. Now, as we move ahead, we realize is that, like I said, the political commentaries were the one which made her the most popular, and that would become her lasting legacy. Her decision to write about issues was of immense significance because of the time it was being written in. I did say that. Why? Because now it was not only considered unconventional, but it was also considered unwomanly. It was also considered unnatural. She became famous overnight with her 1790 work, Vindication of the Right of Men, which she had written in response to Edmund Burke, who had criticized the French Revolution in his 1790 work, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, student, again I would like to bring to your notice that when I use the term criticize, that is my personal opinion. Maybe when you read such works, you have a different interpretation of it. So similarly, in 1792, she went on to write a Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, this was the work which put her in the limelight. Why? Because in this work, she stated very emphatically that women and men should be treated equally. Women and men should be believed that women and men have the same intellectual capacities, and they both are rational beings, and no effort should be made to consider women below men in terms of intellectual being. Similarly, she also said that there should be co-education, and parents, that is both the father and mother and not solely the mother, should be involved in rearing of the child, in bringing him or her up. So these were ideas which were raised at a time which were very rare and which were never really spoken of so loudly, so emphatically, so strongly. And that is what made all the difference, and that is what made her stand apart. And in fact, another aspect is that she spoke this by writing a work against Rousseau. Rousseau had written, let us go to the next slide. What I am trying to say is that Rousseau had written Emily. And in that, he is constantly talking about how a man or men should be educated, should be polished more to develop their intellectual capacities. But when it comes to women, he is very clear that she should be educated only till 8 years of age, and the focus of education should be more on those aspects like needlework, painting, basically those very things which contribute to the household work, household duties, because that is what she is born for. And that is something that didn't go down well with Mary Wollstonecraft. She, let me again say here, she did appreciate very strongly what Rousseau advocated about education, about the education of a man. But when he speaks about the kind of education that women should get, which is very much different from that of a man, that is what is being questioned by Mary Wollstonecraft in her A Vindication of the Right of Women. Now, I am going to make a quote from here, which clearly shows, which was made by Mary Wollstonecraft, and it clearly shows the kind of position that women occupied during that time. She had stated that in the education of women, the cultivation of the understanding is always subordinate to the acquirement of some corporeal accomplishment. Besides, in youth, their faculties are not brought forward by emulation and having no serious scientific study if they have natural sagacity. It is turned too soon to life and manners. They dwell on effects and modifications without drawing them back to causes, and complicated rules to adjust behavior are a weak substitute for simple principles. So what is she trying to say here? She is trying to say here the kind of education that the Enlightenment period, the period of 18th century, believed or provided to the women or the females of that time. This is what she's trying to show here, that their education was focused on more on their mannerism. The focus was more on mannerism than on developing their capacity, intellectual capacities, their knowledge, or developing them in various fields like mathematics, like science. These were not subjects, or these were not aspects for which the women was supposed to focus on. So she has beautifully depicted it in her work. Now, like I said, when I'm talking about Rousseau and Mary Wollstonecraft, it would be unfair if I do not quote certain lines by which I can show you students what I'm trying to communicate here. So let us go to this page and let us see what exactly made Mary Wollstonecraft write that work in response to Rousseau. Now, Rousseau in his work viewed women's role as being restricted to that of mother and wife. He went on to make certain crucial statements like, let me quote, "A woman's education must be planned in relation to man." What did he mean by that? Think about it, students. What was he trying to convey here? Why does a woman's education have to be viewed in comparison to a man? What is he trying to say here? In the second statement, he went on to say, she will always be in subjection to a man. Notice the emphasis on the word subjection. Similarly, in the third statement, he states, she will never be free to set her own opinion above his. Clearly, Rousseau viewed women in a very different manner. And this is something Mary Wollstonecraft decided to raise her voice against. She wanted emancipation of women. She wanted to uplift the social stature of women. And that is why she wrote the work that now is one of the most famous. Mary Wollstonecraft, let's see here, speaks in fact against all these assertions and strongly states through her powerful statements, let me quote, "I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves." What is she saying here? What she is saying here is she wants the women to feel empowered. She is in no way saying that, I want a female utopic society where the females are the one who are ruling over men. She is simply saying that every female should be able to accept what is right and wrong for herself, and it should be nobody's business to decide what status she has to occupy. A woman should be able to feel empowered from within and not above men. And that is what she's trying to convey here. Now let us look at the next statement. She states, it is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them as part of the human species, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. So again, she makes a very important point here. She demonstrates strongly that it is time for women to stand up for themselves, to bring in a revolution, and it is only then can a change be brought out in the world. It is only then can things be changed. It is only then this chain of social hierarchy can be broken and equality can be brought into existence. And this is what she has tried to show through her work. When we move ahead, as I have already repeated a lot of times, that this was one of her most revolutionary works. She was a revolutionist in her own kind. And these very ideas which she had depicted, very interestingly, were attacked not just by men, but females alike. She even went on to dedicate, she made all efforts. What one understands is that she made all efforts to put across her ideas to various sections of the society. In fact, she even dedicated her work to Talleyrand, who was designing a national education program for boys in France. She felt and hoped to be able to convince him to include within this system girls also. And that is why she dedicated her work to Talleyrand. Now, she was a revolutionary of her time in the sense She desired women upliftment. In the sense, she decided to speak against all the social downcomings which were preventing the growth, not just of a particular section of the society, but the entire society as a whole. So this whole idea of writing during a period when the age of enlightenment itself is very emphatic. So what I'm trying to say here, students, is that one's own life as well as the background that one is approaching or dealing with is of immense significance for the work that is being written during that time. And that is what I'm trying to show here. I discussed here the work of Mary Wollstonecraft. I discussed here how it was written, why it was written, in response to what it was written, what was her life all about, how she traveled through it, what kind of people she met. I mean, if she has an abusive father at home, of course she is going to not just since she had a rebellious streak within herself, she decided to stand up for herself, which became all the more underlined by the kind of people she met. The John Arden, the person who had a great influence on her, who was a philosopher who went around delivering lectures, polished her intellectual capacities to a large extent and made her write all these works. So that is why it is of immense significance to see why certain writers wrote what they had to during that time. Now, her publisher, I had spoken about him a while ago, Joseph Johnson, was constantly encouraging her. Unfortunately, there was very little support from her literary companions. Her publisher was very encouraging, and that is why she was able to bring out such works, which in today's time are extremely influential, because now the feminist movement have developed, and women's movement, women's right, suffrages are something that we often hear. But during those times, these ideas were at their nascent stage, and there were women like these who developed them to what? I mean, she is known as she bringer of the revolution, feminist revolution, to stand up, to raise voice for women's equality. Now, so this is what I wanted to talk about here. And in fact, unfortunately, though, there were very lot of literary companions who didn't stand up for her, but there was several other people who did stand up for her. And there was Virginia Woolf, whom we know, and she went on to say, she is alive and active, she argues and experiments, we hear her voice and trace her influence even now among the living. And that itself is the most emphatic statement, which itself demonstrates the kind of position Mary Wollstonecraft occupies. Now, students, in today's session, I had spoken about Mary Wollstonecraft, and there are other few feminist writers like Emily Dickinson, George Eliot, Jane Austen, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Virginia Woolf, who too in their own way played a significant role in upliftment, in emancipation of women. And maybe in some other lecture we can discuss about them separately. Therefore, students, for today this is enough, and in the next session I will be talking about certain Indian feminist writers, certain Indian women writers who, very much like Mary Wollstonecraft, played a significant role in emancipation of women through their influential works. Thank you, students. Hello students. In the last session, I had spoken about certain world famous feminist writers who exactly changed the very idea of women emancipation by their works. And one such female writer that I had spoken about was Mary Wollstonecraft, who played an extremely influential role in the emancipation of women through her writings. In fact, her own daughter, Mary Shelley, went on to write Frankenstein, and her own husband, William Godwin, was a radical thinker of his time. And all this was happening during the period of Enlightenment. I have discussed it all. You can watch that session to have a further clarity on it. Now, let us look at some Indian women writers and how the Indian scenario, how the scenario of Indian writing regarding women developed. Let us begin. Now, Rasa Sundari Devi was one of the first famous individuals who went on to write an autobiography known as Amar Jeevan, also known as My Life. During the 19th century, I mean, this was a time when in India, as we know, and the Indian subcontinent, there was a severe suppression of women that they had to go through, and they were believed to remain restricted in the private sphere. But Rasa Sundari Devi charts out how she lived a life in the private sphere, and through her writings encourages other women to stand up, to fight, because of the trouble, the kind of discrimination that she is made to face, the kind of life that she is made to live as a women of that time. She discusses all the social issues, and that itself is very significant to throw a light on the situation of women during that time. Now, there was a social reformer known as Savitribai Phule, who was one of the, I mean, she's lesser known because of Jyotibai Phule, who is another social reformer. They were husband and wife. But Savitribai Phule is considered, and she is believed to have begun the first school for girls in the 19th century in the Indian subcontinent. I mean, that was, and the step that she took was itself very emphatic at a time when women were not given much freedom to step out into the public sphere. Now, there was Tarabai Shinde, who went on to write Stree Purush Tulna, which itself was a very significant work. There is Pandita Ramabai, again another important figure, because she played an extremely active role in the emancipation of women. She championed the cause of women's rights and went on to speak for women equality during that time. And then eventually, you know, after post-independence and the 20th century, we come across people like Kamla Markandeya, Nayanthara Sehgal, Anita Desai, Shashi Deshpande. But students, here I want to talk about a figure who during her time was famous as well as controversial. Of course, the oxymoron that I am trying to bring in here itself is enough to highlight the position that she occupied during that time. She is none other than the famous Kamla Das. Let us look at it. So, Kamla Das was born in 1934. The picture that you see below on your right hand side bottom is that of Kamla Das. Kamla Suraya, I mean, the name Suraya came because she converted to Islam, which again garnered controversy. She stood up for her rights. She garnered controversy because of a conversion to Islam by the various religious fanatics of that time. But she did what she considered was her right. and she decided to confidently convert into a religion of Islam because she found peace in that religion. Now, at the age of 65, just for knowledge, it was at the age of 65 that she converted into Islam. Now, Kamala Das is better known by her pen name, let me quote from here, Madhavi Kutti, as well as Kamala Das. These were the names which she usually used, and in fact, she usually wrote in a bilingual language. So, she was from Kerala, she was born in Kerala, and she excelled. Not only she, she got inspiration because her mother herself, Balamani Amma herself, was a writer. Her great uncle Nalapat Narayan Menon too was a well-known writer. And she often states that during childhood she remembers her uncle who would indulge in extensive writing from morning to evening. But she also observes that being a female, her mother could not get so much time to engage in writing as much as her great uncle did. So, the inspiration perhaps can be believed to have come from all these sources, from her very family, which had great literary personalities within it. Now, let us proceed, students. Now, why is she so famous? And why is she seen so differently as compared to other writers, and why I have chosen her? The reason is, which I am going to talk about, will clear the concept as to why I have chosen her as an individual. This is because, again, she raised issues about womanhood, the ideas of womanhood, like the female sexuality at a time. It was not very late, it was few years back, you can say few decades back. But again, it was not very well received by our traditional Indian society. So, students, she was very explicit about her ideas, and that is what made her famous, and at the same time made her receive a lot of flack. Her open treatment, like I said, of female sexuality is one such area which she depicts in her various works. She was a confessionalist. She is vocal about her life. There is no stoppages when it comes to various ideas of sexuality, sensuousness, the idea of eroticism, and she brilliantly portrays it not only in her poems but also her autobiography known as My Story. Now, in fact, much of her literary work, she, like I said, as well as for her conversion, she has received several amount of criticism for it. She spent most of her childhood days in Calcutta. Now, I'm trying to show that how she came to be and how what was the impact as to why did she write such kind of a poetry or such kind of a work. Because every individual's, like I said in the last session, every individual is deeply impacted by the society they live in, the kind of people they interact with, and the kind of background that is working out during those years, during that time. Now, when one looks at the biographical information of Kamala Das, one realizes that most of her childhood was spent in Calcutta, where her father used to work. And apart from a great uncle, like I can see from my knowledge that I have gained, is that she was also impressed by the writings preserved by the matriarchal community of Nayars. Unfortunately, she was married, like most of the girls of that time, at an early age of 15, and she bore a son at the early age of 16. And she is often believed to have said these lines, that I wanted to fill my life with as many experiences as I can manage to garner, because I do not believe that one can get born again. So, like I said, she was very vocal about what she said. She was very clear about what she wanted. She wanted to enjoy her life, even if that meant to break the shackles of conventionality. And that is what she did. She wrote columns. She also decided to float a political party, though she was successful when she fought elections in the year 1984 for the parliament, and she engaged in conversion into another religion. And So basically all these aspects clearly justify to what she said, that I want to fill my life with as many experiences as I can manage to garner, because I do not believe that one can get born again. Now throughout her life, she experienced a sense of inequality. As she states in her autobiography, My Story, which was written at a very early age, 42 is not very late, she had stated that her father was an autocrat and her mother vague and indifferent. So clearly one can see that when Kamala Das was growing, the kind of environment she lived in, the father was autocratic, he was dominating, and the mother clearly indifferent. Maybe she had come to accept that is how women are supposed to live in the Indian society, and that is how the system works in Indian society. And of course, the very fact that she is vocal about these ideas, she is very outspoken about these ideas, emphasize and put forward the idea that she was against the gender inequality that existed during that time. In fact, she believes, as she sadly claims, that her parents thought of her as a burden. So in her autobiography, basically, she's talking about the time when she was married off at an early age of 15. And that time she realized and she felt that she was considered to be a burden, and perhaps that is why she was sent off at an early age. She complains openly her inner agony. As she states, let me quote from here, I was sent away to protect a family's honor, to save a few cowards, to defend some abstractions, sent to another city, to be a relative's wife, a horsefly from his home, and a mother for his sons. Yet another nodding doll for his parlor, a walkie-talkie, one to warm his bed at night. Now this in fact is a very painful demonstration that Kamala Das puts across to her readers. This was something that most of the women experienced during that time. They were married off at an earlier age, they had no rights of their own, they had no choice of their own, and that is what is considered by many, not just by Kamala Das, but also by various feminist believers to be wrong. Now, feminism is about equality, and that is what through her work Kamala Das is trying to depict. The painful agony, it is trying to engage the reader, it is trying to make the reader question that things now need to be changed, because there is tremendous amount of hierarchies that exist within the society. Until the time these hierarchies are not removed, these shackles, these barriers are not brought or broken apart, things can never change and the society can never progress. And that is why she decides to give an insight into her life through her various poetries, through her autobiographies, and through her decisions that she made in her life. Let us move ahead, students. Now, in another essay which is titled My Instincts, My Guru, she clearly says what she desires. The very aspect I discussed before, let us look the exact idea that she is trying to convey here. I don't want to be emancipated, because I have seen many of them totally emancipated. By many of them, of course, she is referring to the women. They irritate their husbands. I hear complaints from men. Their wives have become so emancipated that they dictate and they frighten them. All the men turn into mice. I don't think there is much difference between a man and a woman. Now, students, as we notice that her ideas are very much different. I mean, maybe she's trying to say, very much like Mary Wollstonecraft, that she does not want to be above men. She just wants an emancipation in a limited sense. Of course, not in the extreme sense that women are almost, superior to that of the male sex. She wants the women to have the same kind of equality as compared to men. and that is what she is conveying here. In the same way, Mary Wollstonecraft and lot of women writers of the time and of several centuries have conveyed that what they want is a sense of equality. They want is that these social hierarchies should be broken apart. They should not exist. Women should have a voice of their own. In fact, like Virginia Woolf said, a woman should have a room of her own. She should have money and a room so she can pursue writing. I mean, that itself is a very emphatic statement. Because through these words, through these lines, all of them are trying to convey the same idea, that whatever an individual wants to pursue should not be barred for him or her. And here, of course, we are referring to the women folk, which have to face a lot of restrictions in the society. So students, this is important to understand why it is very significant to bring about an equality. And why all these writers wrote in such a manner. Now, let us look at few of the aspects, few of the poems where Kamala Das, painfully in her reveals her agony, reveals her frustration, reveals her dislike, and all kind of emotions come together in a poetry which is so explicit, so outspoken, and so boldly stated that it went on to receive lot of criticism. But students, imagine to be writing such kind of poetry at a time and imagining what kind of individual she might have been, who went on to take such steps, who went on to become so explicit. She was a great woman of her time. That is what one can think of her as. So now let me quote few lines from her various works and try to understand the very aspect that I am discussing here. She is rebellious, she is strong, she is assertive. Now let me quote few lines and she clearly depicts the harsh reality the woman has to live. Dress in saris, be girl, be wife, they said, be embroiderer, be cook, be a quarreler with servants, fit in. Oh, belong, cried the categorizers. Now these are certain beautiful lines through which she has demonstrated that women are believed and they have to fit in to certain roles which are tagged by the society for them. And like she says, the role of she has to wear a sari, embroiderer, she has to be an embroiderer, she has to be a cook, and she has to be restricted to a private sphere, constantly fighting with servants. So again, it becomes important. I mean, maybe she's trying to show here that women of all categories are discriminated upon by the categorizers. Her openness, like I said, in a way brings out the sufferings, the trauma, the lies, the pain, the hypocrisy, and all that makes one feel the kind of suppression and submissiveness that the women had to suffer. Her purpose of writing this autobiography, now let me quote of here is that I needed to disturb society out of its complacence. I found the complacence a very ugly state. I wanted to make women of my generation feel that if men could do something wrong, they could do it themselves too. I wanted them to realize that they were equal. I wanted to remove gender difference. I wanted to see that something happened to society which had strong inhibitions and which only told lies in the public. Clearly, she demonstrates the kind of hypocrisy that existed during that time. And I mean, through her autobiography, when she speaks about why she was writing this kind of autobiography, these lines are eventually very significant because they clearly depict the idea of writing the autobiography. She wanted to open up everybody's eyes, wanted to show the gender difference, wanted to tell the world that if men can make mistakes, so can women, and she wanted that there exists or there comes to exist a sense of equality amongst the society. Now, throughout her body of writings, she has written several essays, short stories, poems, and autobiography. Like I said, she is very bold and she is extremely unshy for what she is saying. Her explicitness is what makes her stand apart from various writers of that time. Like I said, in the old Playhouse and other poems, I'm going to quote from here. She says beautifully the kind of non-identity that exists for a woman in this world. How women are not sometimes even regarded as individuals, but non-entities. So she states, you turn me into a bird of stone, a granite, dove, you build around me a shabby drawing room, and stroke my pitted face absent-mindedly while you read with loud talk, you bruise my pre-morning sleep, you stick a finger into my dreaming eye. I mean, how painful is that? The kind of reality that she's portraying here. And this is what I'm trying to say, that she's very bold and very explicit. She's clearly demonstrating. She's not using much of metaphors and symbols or meanings which are not conveyed easily. She's, clearly depicting the kind of injustice that is being done to the women of the contemporary times. Without going deeper into the lines, one can in fact easily understand. I mean, look at the last line, you stick a finger into my dreaming eye. A woman is not allowed to pursue her dreams. And even if she decides to do so, hindrance is being offered by the very person, by the very male chauvinism that exists in the society. Now, her autobiography, like I said, it also reveals a lot about her own life in her various assertions. And one such incident, I'm going to quote from here, that in one such incident, she talks about the kind of experience she had when she gave birth to a child and the kind of reaction she received from her husband. Let me quote, having him at my side during the night reminded me of my husband, and I wrote asking him to come home on leave. When he arrived, he grew disgusted with the child, who woke up several times during the night to take his feed. Take him away to your grandmother's room, he cried angrily. I cannot sleep with all this noise and fussing. The baby clung to me, and I sensed that he too felt the humiliation. Now, I mean, isn't it a sad depiction of the everyday affairs that a woman has to go through, and these very affairs which are very disturbing, these very affairs which have nothing joyful about it. And this is what Kamala Das is famous for, that she's openly talking about it. Now, when I move ahead, she also, through her talking, gives us a glimpse of the harsh reality that exists during that time, the kind of patriarchal dominance, the male chauvinism on daily purposes. Yet her dauntless attempts leaves one with a sense of self-confidence. I mean, all these readings not only open up one's mind, but also compels one, to stand up for one's own right. What is right? To stand up for that. Not to feel superior over somebody, but to stand up for what is right. To exist at least as an individual, not as a dependent. To be an independent, in fact. And this is what her writings are trying to convey. And she is very different from other writers. I mean, there were other writers who wrote several poetries, like we have Toru Dutt, we have Sarojini Naidu. Now, Toru Dutt is considered to be a first female Indian writer who went on to write in English, and she actually wrote both of them, Sarojini Naidu and Toru Dutt, can be believed to have written very romanticized sort of poetry, because maybe the need of the hour at that time was that, and maybe they did not want to engage in these deeper issues. And so that is why they engaged in issues like that during that time. I mean, like we can see from here, a lot of her poems, I'm talking about Toru Dutt here, revolved around various mythological figures like Sita, Savitri, Sindhu, and similarly many of her poems are romanticized, which I talked about, the lotus, the tree of life. These are all romanticized poems. When we talk about Sarojini Naidu, she's considered the Nightingale of India. Not only she wrote several poems which were romanticized, she also wrote certain poems which had a revolutionary zeal in them. So, these were like Immortal India. They were like Mother, which demonstrated all. Now, Kamala Das was a bit different from all of them, and I have shown that to you in my discussion in today's class. Now, she received appreciation not only for her poetry but also for being an excellent columnist, and we had discussed about it in the last few slides when we look back. And her purpose of floating a party, Lok Seva party, was again to promote secularism. She attempted that in her lifetime she is able to bring about certain changes for the progression of the society. In fact, like I said, she had contested unsuccessfully in the 1984 for a seat in the Indian Parliament. She in fact was nominated, not many know about it, she was shortlisted for Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1984, and she also went on to receive various awards like Award of Asian Pen Anthology 1964, Kerala Sahitya Academy Award 1969, Sahitya Academy Award 1985, and Asian Poetry Prize 1998. So she got several accolades during her time. She was very explicit about whatever she did with, and that is what made her stand apart from various other female writers. Now, let us move ahead. Now, if I want to conclude, what can I say? I can say that though there was a lot of criticism that Kamala Das during her lifetime and even now receives, but there were many who had noticed the kind of legacy that she had left behind. And in fact, it was for this that Prema Nandakumar, who had once noted that she burst upon the Indo-Anglican scene like a daring, fascinating spectra of unconventionality, blowing to smithereens the traditional reticence of Indian womanhood. So students, in today's session, I spoke about one of the famous female feminine writers, Kamala Das, who through their boldness, frankness and explicitness conveyed the kind of everyday tragedy the woman has to go through, has to live. But of course, like I discussed, there are several other Indian women writers who again depict the trauma that they had to go through, or perhaps the everyday woman has to go through. And all of them are conveying the very one message loudly and clearly through their writings, that is, to stand up for their rights. And this is what feminism is about. So in the last session, I spoke about Mary Wollstonecraft, and in this session, I spoke about Kamala Das. Both of them were revolutionaries in their own sense. Both of them were rebellious in their own sense. You know, if you try to compare them, you will understand what I'm trying to say. And of course, there are several other famous women writers, like Virginia Woolf was one of them, who played a significant role, Toni Morrison, and a lot more. So students, hope you enjoyed today's session, and I look forward to meet you all in other upcoming sessions. Thank you.
With this note, we would like to thank Ms. Anaya Chaudhary for her precious inputs to the lecture. And dear friends, you too can give your feedback at info.cec@nic.in. If you have any query which you like to be answered, then you can contact us at info.cec@nic.in. We will be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geetika.